Hello there. Uh, this is the second episode for the Araucanian Resistance podcast, also known as the Araucast. This is a moment where I would like to have a British accent, like the guy from the Eastern Roman history, like hello, but I don't have it, and I won't fake it. So let's proceed. Uh, that's a that's a good thing that we got back really quickly to a new episode. Because when you start a new project, you always fearful that it'll be a dark horse, right? You just begin and then your enthusiasm will fade away quickly. But I think I have plenty of ideas for episodes and even other uh, some ramifications for the channel as well. But regardless, tonight, actually here we're recording. I'm being helped again by Emerald and the Hermit. So thanks guys for being here again. And if you want to make some introductions, go on.
So good evening. Thanks for having me again, Beppe, and thank also Emerald for being with us. And so let's go talk about the today's theme, which I think is very interesting, and I think we're going to have a nice conversation. Uh, as you guys know from me from my last episode, or if you haven't checked it out already, I'm the Hermit. I usually talk about politics and culture stuff, sociology, and etc. And yeah, that's what we're going to talk today, basically.
Yeah, today I think the topic is about the West, right? And if Brazil is part of the West, so we have a lot to say about that. And I must say something. My internet connection today is kind of bad, so if something happens, please don't don't hold it against us, okay? Brazilian internet here, so the connection isn't the greatest.
Yeah.
And other than that, I think it's a very interesting topic that we have for today. And I've been writing. I have some stuff in English, but I've been writing mostly in Portuguese for some time now, including the rise of some, let's call it, dissident movement in Brazil, which I hope to someday publish, or at least not let it just rot in my hard drive. So yeah, that's where I've been mainly obsessed or focused in. And
Okay.
it relates to our topic today, right, Beppe?
True. Yeah, and we'll make sure to raise awareness to it when you publish those writings.
When and if.
Yeah. Okay. One more thing that I need to say. Oh, as we are talking about some technical aspects of the episode, someone have pointed out that our audio was not is not too good on the latest episode, and I was a bit aware of this because my input here, even if I raise it, be, be, if I raise it above 100%, it still doesn't capture well. Maybe it's something on my headset, but I have managed finally to change the OBS settings to separate my audio track and my guest tracks so that I can uh, mix it more properly and add some bigger gains and so on. So I think for this episode we have better audio quality. And to be honest, I should have done this before. This is not the first time I'm recording stuff, and I should have known better how to do that. So, but regardless, as Emerald has said a while ago, this theme today is about the westernness of Brazil, if I say so. Uh, and the motivation for it, one of the motivations, at least on my side, is that voice in the back of my head. Every time I talk about some issues that come to I don't know, more first world places and so on, there's always actual people or that voice in the back of your head that keeps telling you, oh, that's not of your concern, that's not of your world. Stop LARPing. You're not part of it. You're from a different world, and you should stop pretending that you're part of this different dimension, right? People always There's always that kind of criticism going around, and it stuck to your mind, right? You keeps wondering, why am I talking about this? Am I just LARPing? Am I being delusional about those issues, those matters, and all that? And one of the instances of this is when we talk about Brazil, assuming we're part of this Western community, right? We're part of the West, quote unquote. And today, I'd like to settle the score. I'd like to uh, bring up that debate so that we can reach some conclusion about the Westernness of Brazil. Are we part of it? Are we not? Are we something else? Do we fit one of the groups that are already established? Is Brazil a different thing? And so on. And it's important to to do this because situating yourself in the world is a first step in order to debate more important issues, right? If you don't know where you are, you won't be able to even debate where you want to go. And I believe the first question that comes to mind, it's a it's about definitions, right? What exactly is the West? What exactly defines something as Western? What is the definition of Western? And there are many ways of dealing with this, right? Is it ethnic? Is it socioeconomic? Is it just a matter of opposition? So I don't know. What do you guys think? Well, do you have something in mind? What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about the West? You think about something being Western.
Well, I think a lot of our discussions of Western ideology and especially identity, because the matter of Westernness or is your country Western or not is largely an issue of identity and national identity of that. So it is of the most paramount importance. So when we think of West, we usually think of it as naturally as it comes, as in opposition to East, and we have a lot of Cold War mentality, so to speak, because that's our framework. That's how our minds got used to think for almost a century now. But if we go looking at the deeper questions, I think we're going to arrive at a point of Westernness, which is much more divorced than the simple East versus West Cold War mentality, which was largely ideological. And even so, you had the non-aligned movement, which Brazil was largely sympathetic, and we got used to thinking that Brazil was part of the great US coalition of the so-called free world. At least it was more properly shown in the first years of the military regime, but quickly after it started trying to align itself more and more with the East and especially the non-aligned to try to form a sort of we'll get to it, but a sort of third way or whatever you want to call it. But I think the central thing is, or at least the start of it, is that we really need to think West in terms outside of this Cold War bloc, which has a lot of flaws and doesn't speak to the deeper ideas of civilization, which I think is that it is really at the heart of the question. It's more of a matter of civilization ideology or historical circumstance.
Emerald, do you have something?
Well, I have a lot of issues with the definition of West because it's always something kind of
Do you
not
really have
very
a
well.
definition? It always seems like something more vibes
Yes,
based to me.
exactly. Exactly. That's the point. Perfect. There's no such thing as a formal definition of the West, but I remember once watching some philosophy lectures on YouTube by Dr. Michael Segru, and he mentioned once a an author that I ended up not reading yet, but I'm interested in his work because he's a Christian existentialist from the last century, right? He's called Leo Shestov, I think, and he has a book called Athens and Jerusalem. And I think that this point between the the Greek philosophical tradition and Christianity, right, or Judeo-Christianity, whatever you want, probably that's what I think. I'm not sure it's correct, and I don't even know how even Brazil fits in there, but that's how I think of West. Because, as I mentioned in the previous episode, I don't think Brazilian people take religion too seriously or anything too seriously, to be honest. And that's kind of a problem when you want to fit the country as a whole in a tradition that is supposed to be based on two things, one of which, at least one of which, we don't take all that seriously, you know. So in this conversation, I think I have way more questions than I do have answers, to be honest.
Okay, you made me think of that passage of the Bible when the Apostle Paul will start preaching to the Greeks, and he says something about the unknown God altar they have there. Basically, say this. I'm not I don't remember the that passage perfectly, but he basically pays homage to the Greek culture and Greek philosophy and tries to establish a dialogue between that and the Jewish tradition. Not exactly the Jewish traditions, but the message he's bringing, right? This new this derivative, somehow derivative from Judaism that will become Christianity. And I believe at this point he's starting to establish this marriage that may well known be may well be the basis for what we consider Western, right?
Absolutely. I remember once hearing Jonathan Pajot mention that it's he has heard Christian thinkers and scholars and philosophers argue that figures like Plato and Aristotle, even though they came before Christ, they were still talking about a layer of reality that would only the only logical conclusion would be the coming of Christ, you know. So yeah, there is a conversation between these two traditions, and if if anything, I think that's where this West concept is. But again, I'm not sure. This is just uh, a theory or just a you know.
True. But I agree. One of the main aspects of the I can say the Socratic project, the project from the first philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, was this idea of an universal truth, right? Because before that, what you had was the traditions of each people of each city and so on. And what they start bringing to the table is this idea: okay, is there some underlying truth that connects all those people, that connects all those cities, that gives us guidance about what is uh, true and false, what is right and wrong, that doesn't depend of just how we do things usually. That doesn't depend simply on tradition. And on the on the Christian thing, uh, the coming of Christ aligns perfectly with this, right? This universal truth that should be shared to the entire world. So, and when you look at anti-Western writers like Dugin, for instance, he 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 seems to agree with this, right? This idea of objective truth, it's something that's it's just Western. It's a Western thing that the West is trying to impose on the entire world. So it, it really it really fits the way I see this.
I was about to mention Dugin because if you take a look at the flag of the Eurasian movement, it's it's many arrows coming out of a single point, which represents like multipolars, right?
Right.
So it's one truth for every single point, every single pole. So I don't agree with that. Does that make me a part of the West?
At least a sympathizer.
Absolutely, that I am for sure.
Okay.
Well, I think we touched on both extremes, right? We touched on the most recent history of the West from the Cold War, and you guys touched on the origins or the birth of the West. So I think that's a good starting point. But I would like for us to ponder a bit on the idea that when we say West, or at least when we say West on this current context, we mean something much more specific than the whole of European civilization, and uh, much less generalized than the Cold War definition. So generally, we can trace it, or I guess I would propose. I don't know if you guys agree that Western civilizations is a subpart of European civilization in a given time frame. So, what do you guys think of that? Specifically, Anglo-Saxon and semi-Protestant French, this area of Europe.
Yeah, that's something that I was thinking about bringing up. When we talk about the West, what's unequivocally Western? What is the thing that, if I say this is Western, nobody will complain. Maybe someone will complain, but most of people won't complain at all. When you think about Western, if I say, Western Europe and the US, are they the West? Okay, I think most people will agree. And if we start from these intuitive cases of Western countries, of Western peoples, we can analyze, okay, what they have in common, what they have that makes them Western, and can we identify those aspects, those elements in other cases, right? But you brought an even narrower definition, talking about this Anglo-Saxon, this WASP word, right? Anglo-Saxon Protestant word, if I understood correctly. And do you think this is the core of the Western world? Do you think it spans a little more? What do you think?
Well, certainly when we think of civilization as this coherent strings of traditions, ideas, and customs and social forms, I think the West has a much more defined identity the closer we get to this sort of triangle on the English Channel and its eventual diaspora, which is France, the Low Countries, and England, and some parts of Germany, namely the Rhine area. And then it's diaspora abroad in Canada, New Zealand, the US, Australia, etc. And this is the core of the West, and that's what some macro historians will tend to call the West, with capital W in general. And at least it's what Carol Quigley defines as the West, at least the West as a civilization, We can talk later about the other areas. If they are not Western, what are they? If they are some sort of gradient from the West, or if they are entirely separate thing. But I think what happens, I don't think Western civilization is an exclusively Catholic or even more Protestant phenomena, but it is really influenced by those humanist ideals and draws, of course, heavily from Protestantism. But mainly those countries and their political traditions, and England, France, and the Low Countries, are what I would call core Western, and in their diaspora, of course.
Got it. That's interesting, honestly. I was thinking about when I think about West, I was thinking almost about the entirety of Europe. Maybe excluding the Eastern Europe and so on. But what you said makes sense because those are the areas of the world that most of the Western institutions, so to speak, uh, come from, right?
It's funny that you say that because when I think of the West, I think mostly of, in Europe at least, I think mostly of the countries that are more Orthodox or Protestant or Catholic, because the Eastern Christianity is uh is Orthodox, right? So it's like the Eastern version of Christianity, and so that would probably include most of the Balkan countries, Russia, and things like that. But the Western ones are would include both Catholic and Protestant, like Catholics such as Portugal, France, Spain. Wait, is yes, uh, and Protestant like the Low Countries and Britain. But what Hermit said is very interesting because those three countries, well, at least two of them, were not only Protestant, but they are the ones who brought, in a way, the Protestant ethic to the rest of the world. And I don't think that the Protestant ethic reached Brazil at all, to be honest.
Not
Yeah.
really.
So, what would that make? What would that say about Brazil?
Well, you certainly bring up an interesting point. Well, I'm gonna talk on this podcast most from the perspective of Carol Quigley, which is the one I have most read on this topic. But certainly, what he would posture as Western civilization, as I said, from these three countries and their diaspora, is what they brought or what they held in common in terms of technologies, institutions, and shared traditions in history. So, Britain and the Low Countries were pioneers in uh, in Protestantism, specifically Reformed Calvinism, which was hugely popular in France too. So they do share this in common. And of course, Brazil is not Calvinist. Well, at least the French tried for a little while before they didn't succeed. But this Protestant work ethic is, we could say, one of the foundations for what would eventually evolve into uh, industrial capitalism, which was, of course, preceded by commercial capitalism, which was much more involved with the Catholic world, specifically Italy. So eventually, Italy moved out of the picture, or at least a little bit, and the prevalence of those countries, of their institutions, and their ideas was what came to dominance and to spot the spotlight on the world stage. And when I think it was Beppe, no, it was Emerald who, it was one of you guys who said, when I think West, I think Europe, which is understandable. I think it is undoubtable that the West is part of European civilization. But we have to understand that European civilization was not the same for thousands of years. And of course, you guys know that. this idea of the universal Catholic civilization was very understandable during the days of the heights of the Catholic Church and the Crusades and whatnot, which back then it really made sense. But the great divergence of these specific countries made this sort of divide kind of visible. So I don't know if you guys are going to agree with me, but I think there is a kind of civilizational divide, at least between the sort of Mediterranean types like Portugal, Italy, and Spain, with those much more as we would call Western Calvinist, Protestant, and commercial capitalist empires.
Well, o- on one hand, I would see the history of Europe as the history of brothers that always try to kill each other. Right? They're always at war. They're always at odds with each other, but they shared to some extent the same mentality because they live under the historic shadow of Rome, right? The historic shadow of the Roman Empire. If there is a divide I could point is that of the areas which were more Romanized and the areas that were not. You have there's there seems to be a fundamental difference between Germanic peoples, Germanic areas, and the ones which were part of the Roman Empire, for instance, or even Slavic ones, which were even further removed. But when we look at England, is one special case, right? Because it is this Germanic country in origin, because you have the Anglo-Saxons and all that, and also later the Norse invasions, the Dane invasions. But he also had a huge Roman influence because of the conquest of Britannia by the Romans as well, but later because of the Norman invasions, right? So you have this perfect mix of Latin and Germanic traditions, not necessarily perfect, but a comprehensive mix that makes it able this English culture becomes able to dialogue of the both words, the Germanic word and the Latin word, the Mediterranean word, and it makes its institutions somewhat compatible with both, in my opinion.
Well, I think you're spot on realizing that Rome was that great binding civilizational agent, and for a long time, the Roman Empire kept the Western world kind of in this coalition. But certainly after the fall of Rome, at least the western part of Rome, it was a civilizational shift, and whatever you want to call the period between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of the great navigational countries, England and the Low Countries, whatever you want to call this period, it was kind of a civilizational rebirth of some kinds, a renaissance, if you will. Um, During this time, the Catholic Church kind of basically held all of it together. It wasn't much of a civilizational bloc. Well, you could call it a civilizational bloc. That's what we would call Europe. But after a certain while, that's what my point. They started to diverge, and I think this great glue that held Europe together, be it the Roman heritage or the European Catholic heritage, eventually led to new forms of life or new forms of civilization, and each of them developed their specific way. Not that they started being suddenly different peoples. I think in large part they, continued being Germanics, Celts, and Catholics in some parts. But you know, as much as Portugal and Spain are different, the as well, uh, England and France are different, and each went their own way and developed their own civilizational bedrock. And I think that's the greater point here, and that's also a curious thing to point out. It is weird that the countries that actually managed to become the core of the West are the most Celtic. Because if we think a little back, before the Romans ruled the world, it was the Celt who ruled Europe. And it's quite ironic that after the Romans kind of did a did a thing with the Celts, they mostly got relegated to the British Isles and some parts of France, namely Brittany. And but after that, they still had a large genetic footprint, and they managed to be the regions which were most connected to the new world and the new ideas. So yeah, I think although they share a common heritage, they do eventually, with the act of history and time, develop into their own thing, but still sharing their roots.
Got it. Yeah, the matter of diversity can never be denied because it was one of the things that made Europe, if you consider it as a whole, very different, right? There's this topic in the study of general history which is called the Great Divergence. It states, oh, when you look at the world in the 1100s or the 1200s, and you had to pick, oh, where will we will have a industrial revolution? You would probably look at the Middle East, the Caliphate, and so on, or at China, because they have more wealth, they have more food production, they have a bigger population, and so on. And when you look at the 1300s, Europe has surpassed both of those. And one of the reasons that may have happened is because of this internal competition, this internal divergence slash competition that led to the mutual improvement, right, of all those peoples, of all those countries, of all those uh, institutions in general. So this can never be denied. This division, this diversity, and this divergence is one of the key aspects of European history. But one of do you want to say something, Emerald?
I was just going to mention that this diversity in Europe is such that even when the European Union was being formed, the French minister, I think de Gaulle at the time, he didn't want Britain to be part of the European Union because it is not part of the continent. It's a it's a country. It's a region that is from the seas. It's not continental. So even geographical things make Europe be very divided. You don't think about this in, for example, the United States. Yes, there's a lot of geographical and nature differences, but there's still somewhat of an American culture, something that unites them all. But it's not the same in Europe to that degree, and it's hard to make such a case. I honestly, I have some trouble siding with Hermit's idea of the West being a more Protestant project because of what you said. I see the European countries as brothers who are infighting in a way too. But at the same time, I don't think they are as compatible as a big Western project. And that's even I mentioned the European Union because I think they try to unite Europe under something that doesn't exist. And maybe calling Europe as the West would kind of be the same thing, only not institutionalized. This topic is very difficult for me. I really don't know.
I guess the topic would be difficult for anyone, but one thing that comes to my mind is that if you put the origins of the West in those in places like England and France, uh, what I can say is that you can exclude the rest of Europe from it, but you have to consider the role the rest of Europe played in shaping the Western ideology. Because so things like what are typical to the when you think about something Western, the I don't know the liberal values, this idea of the supra ideological, the supra religious order that can can embrace a broader range of of people. There are a broader range of ideologies, a range of religions. It started because of the interactions between countries, the interactions of countries inside of Europe. Liberal ideology was not developed because they needed to go along with Muslims in the Middle East. It happened because they needed to go along with because I don't know Catholics and Protestants needed to go along in Europe because uh, they would kill each other if they didn't do that to the last guy. So there's you can say that the Western way of thinking and institutions were developed in this more restrict part of Europe, but that development depended was heavily influenced by and was almost determined by the interactions with the rest of Europe. You can talk about a microcosm inside of England because you have the conflicts between Puritans and Anglicans and so on, and but you can see the same thing happening in the continent as a whole.
Yeah, that's true. Certainly, the great leap forwards or backwards or whatever you want to call it in terms of civilizational arrangements came out of those fault zones or of these great areas of conflicts. Certainly, the great French wars of revolution were central in this, at least in France, and of course the whole Dutch identity was formed out of fighting the Spanish. So it is clear that civilization kind of develops on those crossroads or in those flashpoints of history. But I think we could all agree, at least for the efforts of this conversation, to circle out the West as those principles most commonly found on those areas where I circled. We could of course embrace this idea that yes, the bedrock or at least the foundation or the previous civilization that heralded this new civilization was this uh, however united but united European civilization, which included all of Eastern Europe to a certain degree, up to a certain point. But I think we have to admit, or we have to come to terms with this idea of the emergence of these new values, which were of course new, drawing upon a lot of old stuff, the older traditions, but building something new upon them. Certainly, you wouldn't find Calvinism, as pointed out by the Dutch and the Synod of Dort in the middle of the Middle Ages. Of course, they're going to develop on top of those ideas. Like iconoclasm was something very old in the from the periods of the Eastern Roman Empire, but which was adopted by the Calvinists. So of course there is some cultural continuity, but there is a certain way in which these ideas coalesced into something more bodily, we can point to and say, yeah, this is the core of the West. This is the those called liberal values. This is the inherent worth of man. All men are born equal. The civil liberties, religious liberties, and whatnot. The this is basically the foundational myth of the West, or are these ideas of the foundation of the United States, the French Revolution, the Dutch Revolt, the Glorious Revolution in England, the Parliament, and this whole Western system with their universities at the top of the food ladder or the power ladder. And this strictly speaking in this institutional level, but I think much more clear to visualize is their uh, shared participation in the great event, which was the technical revolution or the industrial revolution, which was preceded, of course, by the agricultural revolution, which started in Holland and was eventually moved to England, which gave way to the rise of the cities and of urbanization, and eventually to the industrialization. And eventually this would spread out to the rest of the world. But we can see the cores of a civilizational, uh, a whole civilizational matrix, not just some isolated points of divergence. And that's the great point.
I see. Well, now that I think about it, I kind of agree with you. Because we talk about those Franco-Dutch English ideals, they had a much harder time uh, getting some traction in other countries of Europe as well. We know a bit of the history of Portugal, right? And even in Portugal, a liberal party was still not hegemonic in the 19th century. They were still trying to get some political space there. So yeah, it's not completely compatible with the rest of Europe. So I kind of agree. I see your point. I kind of agree with that. But that makes things a bit harder because I was initially was thinking, oh, okay, we can agree that something like Portugal is Western and Brazil as a Portuguese colony, how much it inherits of this Westernness. But now even that is up to debate, right? And but when you talk about institutions, there's something that comes to my mind. I think that was Emerald that said when you look at the people, it's a bit obvious that we don't have those Puritan values, this Puritan work ethic, or some other values identified with the Western nations. But when you look at the
I
institutions,
said Protestant in general, not
yeah,
Puritan
oh,
necessarily.
okay, my bad. I remembered it. They didn't remember it properly. Uh, when we look at the institutions, the history of Brazilian institutions is mostly an attempt to copy French and American ones, right? And America as a as an inheritor of British values would be part of it as well. So, what do you think that being Western is more of a cultural thing, or an institutional thing, or both, or which one has the priority here?
I, well, before answering that, I would just like to point something out that you reminded me of the French influence in Brazilian intellectualism. Um, yes, there were points in our history where, for example, the Dutch were in the northeastern region, right? But that was very short-lived. It didn't go anywhere. It was positive, but it wasn't like long-lasting. But to this day, French intellectualism is still very strong in Brazil. In the previous centuries, for example, you will see that things like positivism came to Brazil very strongly. Like our flag, our national flag from 18. I don't remember the year of the flag, but the republic was born in
1889.
1889. Yes, but the flag, I think it's not from that year. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It comes from a there's a little sentence there in the middle of the globe of the blue globe, which is order and progress, which is taken directly from Comte, which is a French positivist. And well, let's just say none of us here is a fan of positivism, right?
True.
And or scientism. And This, by the way, I highly suggest to everyone the book Hayek wrote on scientism. It's Studies on the Abuse and Decline of Reason. Gives a good history of these ideas. But anyway, French influence in Brazil is very bad. We got psychoanalysis, we got positivism, and we got even spiritism. It all came from France and it all came here. So, although France has a lot of positive things about it, I don't think that Brazil absorbed the positive things. So, um, I'm not a fan of French influence in Brazil. Okay, now about being Western being something culture or not, I think it's I think it's mostly cultural, yes, because you can't expect, especially in Brazil, for anything else to be um, an identity thing. Because first of all, we are a very mixed country. We're all mulattoes here. There's no there's no pure like tradition. Everything is mixed up. We talked about it in the last episode. So, but that doesn't mean that there is no such thing as different Brazilian cultures, right? And maybe that some of them can be more Western than than others. And maybe in some places of the country, particularly in your region, I think there is a more Western tradition in the sense that hermit um, things like this more Protestant thing, Calvinist maybe, and that even we talked about this on another occasion, but in the South there are more even Protestant churches than in the rest of the country. Brazilian Catholicism Catholicism is the greatest um, Christian denomination here, but it's not as strong in regions like the south of Brazil. And maybe that's one of the reasons why it's a very different uh, region. But that doesn't mean that the people are like genetically different or something. It's just that the culture is built that way, you know?
Oh, about the last point, I'd say that well, if you consider the complete picture, yes, it's not as strong, but is there is more concentrated, right? If I'm not mistaken, the least Catholic and the most Catholic cities of Brazil are all in the same state, the most southern state here, Rio Grande do Sul, because one of them was a German colony, so everybody there was is Lutheran. so, so you have these big concentrations uh, of non-Catholic creeds, mostly Lutheran creeds, because you have the German immigration and so on. So yeah, you can make the case that as a whole is a less Catholic word, but you can have points of strong Catholic adherence as well. So it depends on who has colonized it.
I see. Yeah, it makes sense because there's Italians, Germans, and yeah, it makes total sense.
Well,
Um,
I'm answering your point that you made earlier, Beppe. I think that the best way to go about civilizational analysis is through analogy to something which we are much more familiar and which you certainly are more familiar, which is the Roman Empire.
true.
So when we think of the provinces of the Roman Empire,
Wait,
we
let
can
me just let me just add something. Are we all
okay,
Roma Bulls here, or is this just I?
yes, of course. But none of us are that as much as you
I'm
can
more
be
of
sure.
a
I'm not really. I don't know all that much about the Roman Empire, but I like the analogy, and I
I'm
want
more of
to
a
hear more of it.
I'm more of a Bizabu, honestly. But sorry, go on.
Yes, so on the Roman Empire, we can talk about something like Romanization or how Roman is your province. So when you think about like Judea, it's going to be very low Romanization. On the other hand, you have places like Hispania or the lower part of Gaul, which were highly Romanized. Uh, so when we think of Western civilizations, uh, we have to think of them, I think, in my opinion, on sort of a gradient level, which it started out it started out small. It started with those most radical forms of Protestantism in England and the Low Countries, and eventually France, which eventually got institutionalized, and therefore you could argue less radical or just the new norm, and they kind of metastasized into something new, which kind of hid their Protestant flavor, but it was still underlying. But it was not the, I would say, the mask that faced off the world, but it came to be more of this civil kind of religion, this idea of progress and of liberalism, which did become the most the greater core of the Western ideology or religion or whatever you want to call it. So the great question is, if we're going to determine if Portugal, if Brazil is Western, is if Portugal is Western. And I think the response is complicated, because I think we can agree that at the same point, the great Western civilizational genesis was starting. Portugal and Spain were at the height of their power, and we have to make a point there, because Portugal and Spain conquering nearly what was it, a fourth, a fourth, a fifth of the world, something like that, which was crazy at the time. Certainly, with the technology of the times, they did constitute a civilizational bloc, especially Spain, Portugal, and Italy combined were the might of Europe for a long time. And if you consider France before it turned to the other side, this Latin bloc, or this Latin civilization, or if you wanna say the continuation of European civilization of that old Catholic order, was still dominant for a long time. Uh, Even leading up to the siege of Vienna and the religious wars, the Catholics still ran Europe and much of the world. So you have to put this into perspective, because for a long time, Portugal especially was not part of the West, in the sense that it was its own civilizational nucleus. It was part of its own civilizational block, and was not a minor partner. It was at the cutting edge. It was Portugal which led the world into the Indies and the New World. So for a long time, I would say, from the Reconquista, from the 600s, 700s, until kind of the twilight of the Portuguese Empire during the 18th century, Portugal was its own thing. And what I think happened is that England and the Low Countries got so far ahead, and we Portuguese descendants have had to do more with the Dutch, and the Spanish with the English. But the Dutch kind of ransacked the Portuguese Empire for what it got, and Portugal was kind of left without prestige and without much leverage on the world stage, even after kicking the Dutch out of Brazil. It kind of got pushed out of the Indian Ocean trade. It still got to keep profiting out of Macau for a couple of years. People underestimate how much money Portuguese Macau made, and kept the Portuguese Empire going for a couple of years. But I think the great nail in the civilizational coffin of the great Iberian empires was first the Spanish Armada, and secondly the French Revolution, especially the guerrilla war which led to the independence of the colonies. I think once Portugal and Spain lost Latin America, it was kind of over for them in terms of the ability to project a civilization. So after that, I think we can start to say the Iberian Peninsula was starting to get colonized by the West, especially by Western ideology. You know, we can talk a lot of figures on Portuguese and Spanish history, but Portuguese most noteworthy by the movement which led to the independence of Brazil, which was this liberal movement trying to install a constitution. And of course, the king would have none of it, so he sent his son to to the Brazilian throne, while he begrudgingly went back to Portugal to sign the constitution which he didn't want. So yeah, I that's my my proposal. I think Portugal and Spain were not part of the West for a long time, and that's where Brazil was born, on this non-Western, especially old European Catholic kind of civilizational structure. But eventually, with the great emergence of the West, then these ideas started colonizing the world, and we can start calling places more or less westernized.
Just one question: do you think that these Western ideas are necessarily they need to proselytize or something? Like,
I think they spread through different methods. I think the most common way it actually propagated was with diaspora, with the English diaspora. So through in the US, the Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that's the primary way. But the secondary way was through revolution. So you had the liberal revolutions. You had it in Portugal, Spain. You had it in 1848 in Germany. You had it in Austria. That's the secondary way. And the third way was through sheer economic pressure. You think of your Commodore Perry, I think, and in Japan, that's Western civilization spreading. That's how Japan turned Western, and especially more after 1945. Then it had no choice but to be Western and adopt a Western constitution, even if their people still are largely collectivistic and kind of much more spiritual than Americans, but they were politically and economically forced to be Western. And you can kind of see this modular approach to the Western tradition, especially in places like China, which have fully adopted Western political and industrial technologies, you can say, but have still retained a much more culturally oriented to the East and to their own civilizational style. So we can start to think of the West as much more modular than we think when we think in the periphery in comparison to its core.
True. Uh, as you have said, and as Europa Universalis teaches us, institutions spread through markets.
So true.
One more thing, you gave all your timeline, all the reasons for the downfall of the Portuguese Empire, but honestly, I blame everything on Dom Sebastião. Okay, jokes aside,
that is a
You
great
got the
point.
Moors.
yeah, why did it bring all the creme de la creme of Portuguese nobility to Morocco? That's crazy. Anyway, Well, one point that you brought up that I think is very interesting is this idea of a recolonization, right? You had these Iberian colonies in the New World and other places, and they went through a process of being recolonized, so to speak, by the Western power, culturally, institutionally, and so on. And that leads me to the question of, okay, how complete, how true, I cannot say that word, how throughout, well, forget it. How complete was this process? Because up to this day, you can look at a particular divide in Brazilian elites. You have the intellectual elites more tied with the older families, the older aristocratic families, and the ones tied to academia, which have this French influence, this more ancient French influence, and you also have the different kind of elite in Brazil, which is more tied to the agriculture, not necessarily agriculture, but the cattle production, right? The agro, as we call here, those Brazilian style cowboys, cattle producers, which have a more American influence, and they are at odds with each other. They have been at odds with each other for a long time. But those are the elites. You can take two approaches when they say it. You can say, okay, the elites are everything because they are the ones who build civilization, right? As our favorite grumpy Austrian YouTuber would say, who cares about the people? Right? We only care about the elites. But you can also look at the people and say, okay, does this influence reach them? The American or French ideals, have they reached the population? Are they rooted somehow in the common people or not? I think depending on how we look at it, we can say we can uh, we can have an idea of the level of westernization of this country. So first question, does the common people matter or just the elites? Is it more institutional or more cultural? And depending on what matters, what's the level of westernization we're in? Because to some extent, as you said, we are a Western. Even a country completely different from the European sphere, the Anglosphere could be westernized, like Japan, which would be a point that I would bring up because you can always talk about ethnicity, right? Is being Western something related to your ethnicity? But when you look at Japan, you could figure at first you can think yes because it's a white thing, but when you look at Japan and how deeply westernized it is, you start questioning it, right?
Yeah. Uh, uh, the question you brought up about people and elites, it's funny you bring this up because we can think again with a Roman Empire parallel. Uh, what's the meaning of the word pagan? It means country folk. It's
True.
the folks which were the later to adopt Christian religion. So when we think about how in Brazil, people in the interior are much later to catch the the Elon Musk's woke mind virus, is because uh, ideology is spread through institutional and technological means, and this spread has geographical and cultural barriers. So of course, people on the countryside always tended to resist more to changes in general. They tend to have this reactionary power to them. But again, if we're gonna talk in a cultural level or and mainly on a civilizational level, I think we gotta talk elites here. And if we're gonna talk elites, it's far gone. We are as Western as Harvard because there's not a single elite in Brazil who doesn't think in the terms of either London, Paris, or Washington, or especially Harvard. So if you're gonna think that yes, Brazil is 100% Western, but I think there's more to it. I think we can't just call say, oh, the elites think this, it's a done deal. Brazil's 100% Western, confirm joining NATO tomorrow. But it's a much more integrated and, as we said, modular process. Because when we talk about this spread of civilization, we have to keep in mind uh, the Carol Quigley points this out perfectly in his book, Tragedy and Hope. But civilization has this kind of spread and this effect of time, which is not linear and occurs in different ways and produces different results. What do I mean by this? Well, if you look at the Great Industrial Revolution, which happened in France and mainly England, it happened after the agricultural revolution, which was this great increase in agricultural productivity. But and the agricultural revolution happened after a political revolution, which was the Glorious Revolution, which installed, I think it was William III from Holland into the British throne. So you had this kind of sequence, a political revolution, and before that you had a religious revolution. So you had religious revolution, political revolution, agricultural revolution, and then industrial revolution. But it comes to happen that technological means are much more quickly to spread than ideological ones. So it happens that the railroad reaches Brazil before the agricultural revolution hits Brazil. So you have presidents who try to fund great industry with coffee money, not with great uh, productive agricultural money, but with cash crops. And so you have this whole phenomena of Latin America turning into this kind of stereotypical military junta oligarchy governments, because you didn't have time to build up a middle class. You jump straight into this big old established cash crops funding the new stuff. So you naturally build an oligarchy. And it works differently in different places. When it happens in China, when China gets the industry before it gets the political change, well, they got the political change before the industrial change, but you get authoritarianism. You get the Chinese Communist Party. So I think we have to approach this with the idea that history is complex and it churns out some strange results. So I don't think it's just the elites are this and it's a done deal.
True. Yeah, you brought a very interesting point here because I was thinking about this. uh when you look at the elites, we're very Western because those elites are westernized, completely westernized, and that reflects on the institutions. But you can always question, okay, to what extent did they succeed in make those institutions work in a Western way, even if they nominally are Western, right? Because the feeling that you have in Latin America, as you say, is this there's this veneer of Westernness that ends up being just a farce. We're trying to make something look like Europe, but we don't have the how do I call it, the cultural structure. We don't have the right process, the right development that can sustain those institutions, right? You can look at, for instance, federation. We have a federation in Brazil. Emerald mentioned our flag, our current flag, which has this positivist mantra of order and progress. But during 4 days after the creation of the republic, from 15th of November to 19th of November, we had a temporary flag, which was basically the American flag with different colors, and we try to mimic them in everything, right? We try to mimic the flag. We try to mimic their political organization, replacing the provinces by states. We were supposing a federation. That federation was never really a thing. There's always this strong central government. which was the only way you could run the country as a complete stuff, as a whole, because you didn't have that level of development that allowed for this decentralization. So we always live in this farce, right? We always live in this. Oh, we're trying to mimic the Western world, but we don't have, as you said, we don't have we we didn't go through the correct process to enable it, and it always becomes a farce.
We like the
So
vibes of the Western world.
yeah, the vibes, the veneer, the things, as you say here, the things for Englishmen to see, right?
Yes, we are more concerned about like progressive American causes than actual Brazilian issues to this day. To this day, dude.
Yeah, I mean that doesn't matter in itself, but when it makes you completely detached from your own reality, it becomes a big issue.
What I think happens is that the great dominant power of our era is now the United States, undoubtedly. For a long time it was France and Britain, and before that it was the Portuguese. So when we look at the trajectory of our culture, before we had a much more distinct identity when we had a distinct Portuguese heritage, but it is undeniable that this Portuguese heritage was gradually and eventually demoralized and lost its prestige with the simultaneous decline of Portugal and the rise of the West. And the elites being the way of that they are always status seeking and prestige seeking and power seeking, went to the next best thing. So there has always been this idea of trying to westernize Brazil, or at least the elites trying to seem more Western because it's the fashionable thing to do. But in concomitance with that, you have the process of trying to imitate and copy the Western institutions. And of course, the economic means come much more easily. We can see it in the fact that in the most rural town of the most poor city and the poorest state of Brazil, you're going to see an iPhone. So goods can travel much more quickly than ideas. So we haven't had the chance, or you could argue we will never have the chance to experience something like a Calvinist Brazil, or at least not in its old form. But the new metastasized form of Calvinism, which is this kind of post war consensus, this egalitarian universalism, it's a kind of it's kind of seen in Brazil in this kind of the way we most people deal with morality and stuff, which kind of views it in a kind of demeaning manner. And Brazil is one of those weirdest cases where the population is most nominally Catholic. I think I don't know if we still have the largest Catholic population in the world, or if we are second now. But for a long time we were the top one. But at the same time, a lot of people don't really care about religion, and we are kind of known to being most one of the people's most liberal with social aspects like relationships, like friendships and etc. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways, the adoption of Western ideals and integration into the Western economy has demoralized our own culture, and we have we are more and more becoming a people without culture and history, which is an issue which is greatly dear to me, and we are more and more trying to become something we're not. And, and in trying to become something you're not, you're most often not going to fail, and you're going to be left in a dark place with nowhere to go.
I think people are mostly trying to discover who they are in a way, or they should be doing that. They should find their own tradition, their own history, and if they are from Brasilia, try to make their own. But um, while you were while you were talking, I connected something in my head about what Beppe mentioned before of the elites or the the population in general. And although much of culture comes down from the elites, as you pointed out, our elites are probably way more Western than the country itself. So this reminds me, because of these reasons that you're just saying, that Brazilians don't take religion all that seriously. Brazilian culture is kind of a big blob, uh, a big identityless blog, let's say. Um, because of these things, I was reminded that Ortega y Gasset. I was thinking about his book today because I saw a review by Michael Mellis of The Revolt of the Masses. And he points out, well, it's one of the core theses of the book, that the masses are capable of destruction. I don't think they are very much capable of building things up. I think that's something for the elites to do. But the masses, they definitely destroy. I mean, even in places like Soviet Union, these regimes fell down because people wanted to have fun. People wanted to listen to Frank Zappa. Wasn't that what happened in Czechoslovakia with Václav Havel? I mean, he literally was buying and selling records in the black market during communism. So yeah, um, he was capable of taking the regime down. The people can do that. The masses can do that, but it's very hard for the masses to create something. So what that makes of Brazil is something um, way more destructible than the opposite, which is concerning and brings back to what you said about the things that you care the most about, like identity and things like that. They're only getting destroyed, and I don't see how that could be otherwise.
Yeah, on the issue of demoralization, yeah, you can surely point out how the foreign influence is affecting Brazil, and what one of the saddest aspects of this, as the hermit mentioned, that the Brazilian demoralization starts with Portuguese demoralization. When you look at our uh, art production, so to speak, there's nothing in the recent past that exalts uh, Portuguese history, right? At least not anything mainstream. The latest thing that I remember that talks about the Portuguese royal family and so on was this soap opera, this short soap opera, which was basically comedy, right? Talking about, oh, Don Juan Sexto, Don Juan the Sixth, he liked eating chicken thighs, or Dom Pedro was a womanizer, and so on. It was this the we have this very uh, caricatural view of the Portuguese royal family that makes we that makes us not taking them seriously, right? And that reflects on the way we perceive ourselves. Oh, we're the product of those people, so we're not serious either, right? But on the other hand, I think about, yeah, we're very Brazilian people tend to be very liberal on a lot of things, but there's a tension here because at the same time it's the spread of westernization is slow in the common people, but at the same time we seem to have adhered to these liberal values too quickly on certain aspects, and it lets me to think, were those values acquired, or were they already part of the population? Why is Brazil such a fertile ground for some, and you can say the most negative aspects of Western culture? Because when you look up authors of fiction from the 19th century and afterwards, every time they deviate from the European uh, standards, from the European role models, they try to make a more Brazilian hero. It's always the vagabond. It's always the guy who doesn't want to work. It's always the guy who tries to find heterodox solutions for problems, which are not as virtuous as the more classical ones. So weren't they looking at the Brazilian society at the time and picking their most important aspects there? Though those things that many people can blame of this Western liberal influence, weren't they already part of the Brazilian mindset? And for this very reason, those Western values ended up finding such a fertile ground. Something that crosses my mind.
I think a way we can approach this question is in a a timely manner, in the sense that we should approach it based on when each country became Western. Because I think it's an important point. Because if we think about when Japan became westernized, it was at the height of the British, American, French, and German empires, in the age of empires. So that's when Japan became westernized, and that's the Western approach they got. When China became westernized, it was at the age of the great dictatorships. So naturally, China became a dictatorship under a Western ideal, communism. Uh, when Africa became decolonized and hence westernized, it followed a number of Western ideologies. What happened in Brazil is that we have had some waves of westernization, right? But the most recent one has happened during a time where Western ideology was at its most pernicious. So Brazil took a long time to westernize, and it is still taking a long time to westernize. But trying to westernize now will surely be a difficult position when Western ideology is at its most regressive and damaging. So I think that's why we see a lot of destructive behavior, and we can't forget that the main time Brazil actually got industrialized and was actually moving forward is when the crack epidemic started, and it was quickly imported here and did untold damage to societies. Uh, it's not a question we usually discuss a lot, but it is an import. It is an import. It was brought here. The great introduction of crack to Brazil. It was kind of the same thing as like the introduction of sugar to the Caribbean. So we have that to think about. My thesis is, I guess I would put, is that nations undergo westernizations under different periods. And of course, if again we parallel that to the Roman Empire, I think a region that was westernized during the early empire period would look much more differently to a region that was Romanized in the later periods. If you think about like the Pontic steppe, it's going to have a much more different flavor. Or I guess if you think about the border Germans, they were not Romanized at all. They had some faint idea of what Roman is, even though they were inside the Roman borders. And I think that's something that kind of affects us in some way. We have been receiving the most poisonous aspects of Western ideology, and we haven't been drinking from the things that which came before, which admittedly were kind of bad. The introduction of liberalism to France was the French Revolution, which we all know what happened. So it has never been a harmonious process, but we seem to be getting a specifically poisonous deal.
There's a counterpoint to the Roman Empire argument that may explain the Brazilian case in a different way. Because when you look at the most Romanized areas of the Roman Empire, weren't necessarily the ones which were conquered first, but were the ones where you had less civilization. The eastern part of the Roman Empire was never that much Romanized because they had this a great civilizational force already, right? They didn't have to found that many cities, coloniae. They didn't have to bring institutions and so on. They ended up being inspired by those regions, right? Because it was an Hellenized world already. One of the reasons people uh, discredit the idea that the eastern part, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire was Roman, is by pointing out how Greek it was in culture, right? And it was always Greek, uh, not always, but was Greeks even since the Roman times, because they didn't have much to do there. They didn't have much to colonize there, to Romanize there. And when you look at the West, the Gallia and Iberia and Britannia, most of those regions that are part of Western Europe, they became much more Romanized because it had this void, this civilizational void that could be filled by the Roman culture, Roman ideology, Roman institutions, and so on. And in that sense, you can say that Brazil could possibly be one of the most westernized countries in the world, or one of the most potential for westernization, for the simple fact that we had nothing here. There is no there's no amount of local culture that could work as a pushback. Even in France, as you said, it was a lengthy process. This westernization, this liberalization was a lengthy process because you had all the weight of French civilization, all the weight of the French traditional medieval institutions to counterbalance it. And when you look at Brazil, you have this big void, which you can debate what's the origin of it. We can even debate if this void is real or just thing I'm coming up with. But it makes me think that the reason why Brazil has this much potential for westernization is the fact that we either abandoned where we never had this cultural force to counterbalance it.
I don't think that's possible for one simple reason. Yes, there is this wasteland, but it's like when you salt the earth, I don't think that anything in the I know it's hard to say in a generic Brazilian culture, but I think there's a lot of hostility towards these ideas. I think they would be absolutely rejected because of, you know, third worldism, let's say it, which we mentioned briefly in the last episode. I don't think these things would ever. I mean, it's possible theoretically, but I don't see a realistic way of that happening.
The funny thing is, third worldism is also a foreign thing, right? It goes through that process of I've learned that term a while ago, astroturfing, right? Making something that which is top down appear bottom up, appear in grassroots. So it's the deep Brazil against this Western influence, but most of the time even the third worldism is a foreign import which only exists in opposition to Western values. So even in that case, we're being westernized. That's what I think.
Well, fair enough. There's nothing more Western than being anti-Western, I guess.
True.
Yeah, I think your point makes a lot of sense, Beppe. And on the latter point, yeah, I don't think there is anything more American than being anti-American.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah, absolutely. That's a great point.
uh, yeah, I don't think there is a lot of resistance to Western ideology here in Brazil. I think what we actually have is a cultural expression of it's a lack of humility and a lack of introspection and of seeing our civilizational status, because we touched this briefly on the last episode, but Brazil kind of demands this level of civilizational respect it hasn't earned. So when we say we are pushing back against these corrupting Western ideologies, we are, in a matter of fact, much more deeply invested on it than we like to admit. We just like to not be caught doing it, you know. But the average Brazilian, it's pretty knee deep into American ideology, and what Beppe said kind of explains a lot of it. It's what Yarvin would call leaking power. And Brazilian institutions were very weak from the offset, and it leaked a lot of power. There were a lot of areas with which the Europeans and especially the Western powers had much more leverage and power to fill. And I'm mainly talking here about media and industry and especially universities and the intelligentsia. We didn't, we had some bright figures here, but we didn't have this intellectual firepower that the Western tradition has, and therefore the last 100 or so years in Brazilian academia has just been discussion of Western ideologies, be it communism or capitalism, and there is no much not much alternative to that. So whenever you leak power, or whenever you have this cultural wasteland, something is bound to sprout up, and it's going to generally tend to be the general reigning empire at the time, which now is the American empire.
How long do you think this sorry, anti-Western or anti-American sentiment has been going on in Brazil?
Uh, I think we can safely say that after the proclamation of the Republic, it started, but it eventually goes much further than that. As much as we love him, we gotta say, Don Pedro II, it started in his uh, in his reign. Even at the time of Dom Pedro I, it was already spreading. We have a lot of Masonic influence here. We had a lot of Jews, especially in the northeast, under the Dutch, and we had a lot of Jesuits, which through bringing high learning, eventually spread a lot of interesting philosophies here in Brazil as well. So I think it's a gradual process, but the most aggressive form and the form that has taken the strongest roots, I think, it is undeniably the 20th century, which was the time we can point to and say, yeah, that's when legitimate Brazilian culture died and started to be, Americanized, as you could say. By the 70s, it's hard to say you had a deep, proper Brazilian culture anymore, and we were in this process of becoming the periphery of the American Empire. I don't think we were ever a periphery of the British Empire, but I think definitely are a periphery of the American Empire now.
Yes, the more I heard you both discussing, the more I realized that yes, you are both correct. And I asked this because I was thinking of the anti-American sentiment that came in the dictatorship, right? because the left was put aside in a way, and most of the current regime that we have today in Brazil kind of started back then. Lula himself said in an interview in, I think, 89, when he was going to run against Collor, that his project was something for 50 years or something, 40 years or whatever. And this anti-American sentiment began because the dictatorship was kind of uh, it was a pawn in the Cold War in a way. We wouldn't lie, we wouldn't align ourselves with the Soviet Union, so we would get something from America, which doesn't mean a lot, right? But it's enough for the anti-American sentiment to explode, I guess. So yes, uh, adding that to what you mentioned, and it's absolutely true that there's nothing more American than hating America. Yes, in that regard, we are very much Western. I would say you both are 100% correct.
One thing that comes to my mind, and of course we can go much deeper in the rabbit hole of the origins of anti-Western and anti-American sentiment in Brazil, but the thing that most comes to my mind is the Modern Art Week. Is that right? In the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken, when I remember reading in a book a joke about those artists, those the content creators of their time, uh, desperately trying to bring up a genuinely Brazilian art, a genuinely Brazilian representation of Brazilian people and art and so on. But at the same time that they were doing that, they're making regular trips to Paris to bathe themselves in civilization. So here they're creating, oh, we'll create something that is actually Brazilian. They create like Macunaíma, the hero, which is a complete a complete lazy ass.
And the genuinely Brazilian art sucked.
Yeah, but at the same time they're going to Paris and actually experience civilization, European civilization, Western civilization, and so on. So ever since that time, uh, there's in the Brazilian mind this passive aggressive relationship with the West, right? You can see it with Vargas as well, because one of the reasons he was able to kickstart part of the industrial, not kickstart, but uh, give a push to the industrial development of Brazil, is that um, he was blackmailing the US, right? Give me what I want or I join the Axis. When you look at the military dictatorship, even though they were part of the you can say the Western or the American aligned bloc in the Cold War, they were doing the same thing. At some point, they had some diplomatic issues, diplomatic um, conflicts with the U.S. and they went to Czechoslovakia to buy the turbines for our biggest power plant to this day, which is Itaipu. They brought equipment for a communist country, for a iron curtain country. So it seems like every regime, even if you consider them right wing, uh, has this passive aggressive approach to Western countries, to the Western civilization, and especially to the US.
So the great thing about anti-Western ideology and especially anti-American ideology is what Yarvin talks about is that anti-Americanism is trying to be more American than America. In the context of Brazil, what this means is that Brazil is always trying to one up America because we are trying to uh, prestige our way to the top by being more American than America. So you mentioned Lula. Uh, we have this image of Lula, the anti-American, the anti-imperialist. But uh, the reason he's like that is not because he hates America. No, because he wants to be more American than America. It's because he thinks America has gone too far to the right, and America is supposed to be this progressive beacon to the world. So whenever you actually see it, you see photos of Lula with American presidents. You don't see the same approach he has with Putin. As much he can talk about his alliances for the third world, but Bolsonaro was much more closer to Putin than he ever was. So there is this idea of trying to be more American than America. And the way it is metastasizing in Brazil currently is the favela culture and the kind of exaltation of the the favela, of the poverty and of low living, because it is supposed to be very disruptive. It is supposed to be a sort of rejection of uh, normalcy and of Western normalcy. Uh, and this is part of the attempt of trying to out-American America. We are trying to project what America is going to be in the future. So, and that's the curse of the periphery, because you are simultaneously trying to catch up and trying to pull ahead. So you have this unbalanced society where you're trying to push uh, you're kind of Europa Universalis for push a slider to the max while you're leaving the others at the bottom just to try to flex your ideological muscles. So you have the current government which says, look how much we have done to the poor. We have 500 more social programs than America, but the country is all a wreck. So you do these things for ideological and cultural purpose, for in the ambition to gain prestige, but you fundamentally forget the principle of government, which is governing.
Now that I think of it, favela culture is basically ghetto culture, right? For Brazilians,
It,
funkers is our rappers.
yeah, it's trying to be more American than America. It's trying to update it. It's putting a third world package on it and trying to sell it as the future. Uh, and and this idea is that eventually uh, this is going to uh, show to it is going to show itself to be more American than America, and the whole world is going to turn into a big favela. That's what our elites think, quite evidently, as this is what they fetishize about.
True. And you can see how things are truly reversed when you look at cases like Tucker Carlson being praised by Alexander Dugin. Tucker is a true patriot, and when you look at his ideas, they are he basically wants to destroy his country and make it irrelevant in the world scale. So being a true American patriot is wanting to destroy the country. Being a anti-American person is trying to be more American than America.
In a weird way, it makes total sense, right? And you mentioned something interesting. Lula is indeed one of the most American presidents we ever had. And this also reminds me of the history of the progressive movement in the US, because basically they came from, well, they secularized low church Protestantism, right? And their goal was basically to create a huge machine, a socialist machine, and govern society like that, because it's I mean, it's wrong, but it makes some sense. If society works like a machine, it's easier to find problems, to solve problems, to change pieces that aren't working, and things like that. And it all came from this movement that imagined America as a chosen country and Americans as a chosen people that would um, bring this socialist or quasi-socialist ideal to practice, because it's kind of like Whig history. We're always going that way, and America, it's we're always getting better and better. And America is the place where we're going to, find our utopia. We're going to found our, it's talked in a very religious manner too. And Lula here in Brazil kind of is like that too. He's trying to bring his socialist utopia, his pan Latin utopia, right? He's trying to outdo this progressive slash socialist sentiment that came from America. And I had never thought about it in those terms. It's very, very interesting what you said, Hermit.
Yeah, you were 100% right that it is Whig history. And in that sense, it is the attempt to find which is going to be the new city upon a hill. So, England was the great shiny beacon of liberty, according to the Whig tradition, which, as history goes on, we moved to the United States, which on its founding myth says that Britain was this oppressive force, this evil kings and taxation without representation and stuff. And then you look at history and you see Britain is the most liberal country on the continent, and the Americans from the Revolution are just trying to be more radical than the radical Englishmen. So that's what the U.S. is founded upon, and ever since the age of the American Imperium, we are trying to see which country or which new civilization is going to replace America. So at first, the great next leap forward was communism. So America, or sectors, the most progressive sectors of of the American regime, were pushing communism worldwide because they were trying to bring forth this very, as you said, religious, eschatological view of the next America, of which country is going to do to America what the America did to Britain. So whether it was the Soviet Union which failed, or China, which we're going to see if it fails or succeeds, everyone is trying to do to America what America did to England, and write off America as this terribly racist and backwards and religious country. But no, we are the true Americans. We don't believe in religion, we don't believe in culture, all we believe is material progress. That was what communism was. And those new alternatives, be it Lulism, or be it Duginism, or be it Arabism, are just attempts of trying to beat the new step in the great battle of who is going to out America America.
Yes, I've always said that the American hate is mostly, well, the hate towards America, to phrase it more correctly, is mostly performative, because a lot of culture that the same people who propose to hate America, they actually consume a lot of American culture or American media or American aesthetics. And when it really gets down to business, it's very hard to hate a culture that you hate a country with a culture that you love so much, right? They're just it just makes total sense. They don't hate America. They think they America isn't American enough.
Well, in day-to-day social media, we see countless of cases of people who pretend to be anti-American or anti. They even use this uh, in a diminishing way. State, what do you say? United Statesian, something like it, which is a shitty term. It means
It
nothing.
makes no sense, by the way.
Yeah, it's like
What
calling
are we,
Brazilians
like,
federal
Republic
Republicans.
of?
Yeah,
Yes.
and at the same time, if they receive the small amount of a tap in the back by some American or a gringo in general, they almost melt down in in enjoy, right? So they are always looking for that kind of approval. I hate you, but you have to approve me, so that we
Yeah,
are equals.
take a look at any influencer or comedian that comes here to Brazil. It's very easy to become famous in Brazil being a foreigner. You just have to come from France or America or Germany or whatever and come to Brazil, go to São Paulo or something and say, "Oh my god, I love Brazilians and I love I don't know."
Just compliment Brazilians in something, and
Yes, on the smallest things.
have a legions of fans who were just the day before they were cursing the U.S.
Oh, I love caramel dogs or something very generic and retarded like that. And yes, they will lick the floor. These people step on over.
That's true. I really miss some kind of approach to those Western powers or first world powers that it has the humility that the hermit mentioned, but at the same time has this willingness to be your own thing, right? The case that comes to my mind, the the quintessential example of westernization, the conscious westernization with all those vices of the third world, is the Meiji Restoration, right? You have the Japanese people looking at the West, say, okay, we're going to lose. If you don't do anything, you're going to lose. Those guys are powerful. Those guys will come here with those with ships with massive cannons that they will blow our country up. So what do we need to sacrifice in order to keep surviving? And that was a conscious decision. We don't see that here because recognizing there are good things to be imported hurts our egos. So we don't do this explicitly, but in the process of not doing explicitly, we do it much more in an implicit way.
The great issue with comparing Japanese westernization to Brazilian westernization is precisely because, as I said, there are two aspects of this. Japan westernized at the height of the Age of Empires, when Britain was still proud and maintaining its empire, and Brazil was westernized by the time that during the anti-colonial crusade of the 20th century. So there's a difference in time there, but there is also what we mentioned before, that Japan had a strong and proud culture which wasn't demoralized. The greatest thing Japan ever came to demoralization was exactly the arrival of the Americans. But before that, the Japanese managed to successfully uh, fight out the Portuguese and the Spanish, and even managed to fight Korea and China alone. So they had a kind of a prestige to hold to. But Brazil, on the other hand,
Yeah, but my point that
excuse me, Brazil, on the other hand, didn't have a lot of prestige, and especially Portuguese and Iberian civilization got very demoralized after the French Revolution.
true. Yeah, but my point is even uh, precisely because of that prestige, the Japanese people, the Japanese elites could get delusional, right? And say, "Oh, we don't need this. We're proud Japanese. We won't adopt the Western ways." But they made this decision. Okay, we need to do something. We need to throw some things off. We need to end the samurai stuff and Westernize to some extent in order to survive and preserve the rest of stuff, the other things, right? And I don't see this kind of attitude from either Brazil or Latin America as a whole. Is always this resentment. Oh, I want to adopt the Western things, but at the same time you're adopting all the time.
I think the greatest glue that held these countries together, mainly Japan and the Germanic countries, was militarism. And there's a phenomena where these countries tend to fare well and be more resistant to ideology, they can easily adopt the technological aspects, but maintaining the sort of uh, rigid culture. We kind of see it with China because China is very militaristic. We see it more especially with North Korea, which is highly militarized and has adopted Western ideology in the form of communism and Western industry, although it hasn't, I think, caught up with the times yet with digital technology. But China has, and China hasn't fallen prey to a lot of America cultural dominance because it still has a sort of prideness to their culture. But I don't think Latin America has that. I think Latin America was severely demoralized and is incapable of it. And it was kind of thrown to the dogs, especially because of the drug epidemic. I think it's just a traumatic event which you don't recover easily from.
True. Emerald, something? I can't think of a way to complement what the hermit has said.
Me neither.
Okay, so I mean we're approaching uh 2 hours of episode, so it's a good time to wrap things up. Yeah, on the on the matter of the westernness of Brazil, how western is Brazil? As always, it depends. You can see you can see as we have discussed here, it depends on what you consider western. It depends on not just that, it depends on what aspect you're at, what part of the country you're looking at. You're looking at the elites, you're looking at the population, you're looking at the institutions, and depending on what you focus on, you'll reach a different answer. But you can for certain say that Brazil has some level of westernization, intentional or not, and that makes us able to dialogue to some extent with the the rest of the westernized world, which is a good thing. But at the same time, there are some barriers, there are some undeniable barriers in that communication. And look, that's not a matter of status. Some people that criticize the idea that Brazil is Western do that from the point of view, oh, you're trying to get the status of the Western powers. You want to be one of them. In our case, that's not true. We're just trying to understand things as they are, because you have to understand your position. You have to understand your place in the world in order to go for in order to reason about it, right? If in the end Brazil is not Western, but a different thing, I don't think it's Eastern either. Right? There are people who say, "Oh, look, the Portuguese language have all those Arabic words, implying that somehow you're closer to Saudi Arabia and Iran than the rest of Europe," which is delusional because we have way more Latin and Greek words in Portuguese. Uh, it's not if that's not if you're not denying the Westernness of Brazil in this way of just aligning with a different power block, I'm open to the idea that we're a different thing. We're part of a different group. Could be the Western periphery. Could be just a new kind of group, a new kind of word. That's all fine by me. But it's important to really understand what's our position. So I don't know what else you want to add to this conversation, guys.
Well, as expected, the big problem here is to define what West is. We started from two different points of view, right? I mentioned the Athens and Jerusalem thing, like being drinking from the fountains of both ancient Greece and Jerusalem, right? But Hermit brought some really interesting points, really, really interesting about the more modern way of interpreting it, and that's still a very difficult. thing. It's a very difficult topic, precisely because of this definition. So, as you said, of course, we're not Oriental. We're clearly not Oriental, but that doesn't mean that we are necessarily the West
But to me,
either.
we're literally like Palestinians.
uh, yes. Uh, in this case, I'm Israeli, um, and I'm totally comfortable not fitting in either of the categories. I mean, it's fine. As you said, it's just a matter of knowing your position, right? However, because much of what the current discourses around politics, and especially dissident politics, revolve around the issue of quote unquote the West, it makes it hard for us to know what applies to us or what doesn't. And I tend to absorb what I think is useful or what I think is insightful and disregard what I don't think that applies, even if it's something that could be better or could be positive. If it doesn't apply to us, then so be it. I think there are also many things we could have mentioned, like in the Brazilian um, relationship with religion. For example, we're a Catholic country, but we have a lot of focus on the Franciscans, right? The Brazilian Catholicism is very focused on the Franciscans, which I think has to do with this romantic rom- with romanticizing the poor, which of course Saint Francis. I'm not going to attack him or anything, but I might think negative. I might think something negative about the relationship that Brazilians have with these things.
But it's true that
And
the Franciscan order had a lot of conflicts with the medieval church before they reached an agreement. There were some discrepancies between the Franciscan thought and the way the church was looking at things. So it's not an attack on Saint Francis saying that this is an heterodox view of Catholicism.
oh, I wasn't aware of that. I'm not that knowledgeable of Catholicism or religion in general, to be honest. But yes, the fact that Brazil does have a very um, a, a focus, Brazilian Catholicism focuses a lot on Saint Francis, should probably point something about our Catholicism and our participation in what would be considered by some as a Western tradition, right? So we're on the margins of something that is already kind of in the margins. And, well, at the end of the day, I don't think that the finding our exact position will be possible, but these ideas influence a lot the Brazilian discourse and what we bring from other countries, like we were saying in the first episode. Why should we bring things that don't apply to our culture, right? And that's the most important thing about this discussion. I think it was a very productive episode. Even though, to be honest, I had some issues because of my connection, but I think it all went fine in the end. So yeah, I think that's my observation.
I could hear you just fine. I think it was good, and thanks for your participation.
The greatest injustice 20th century ideology has ever done to Brazil was lumping all of Latin America onto the category of third world, which is, of course, going to be a topic of discussion of later episodes. But This idea that the third world is this undistinguishable blob has one specific issue, is that the specificity of Latin America in relation to the rest. Because, as we've discussed, Latin America has the distinctive characteristic of having been part of an earlier European civilization which was not Western. So we can think of the Russian or Orthodox civilization as the same thing. It was part of a, it is part still of a European civilization which is not Western. And, Catholic America and Iberia was this civilization before it got defeated and demoralized and gradually started to be absorbed into the Western order. So the place we are here in Brazil is that we are kind of in this shadow realm or twilight zone where we are third world, but we are not third world because we have a specific background which separates ourselves from the rest of the third world. And we are part of the American periphery, which is undeniable. We are a glorified American satellite state, but we have this tendency of American thought in an ideology of trying to out America, which produces different results in different parts of the world, especially in European descendant civilizations. So the question of is Brazil Western ends up being less interesting than the wild things which are going down here in the tropics. But still, I think we have come to a satisfactory answer to the question. On the question of is Brazil Western, I would say it certainly wishes it could be. It is trying to be, but its results are ending up very different from what anybody could expect.
True. And I want to thank again. I think I haven't thanked you before, but I want to thank the Hermit for bringing here some new perspective that really changed this episode. It didn't ended up the way I was envisioning, but that was a good thing because I wasn't looking at many aspects that you brought up. So once again, I want to thank our spectators, our audience for listening to this episode. I hope you have enjoyed it. And I know, thanks Emerald, thanks Hermit, and I hope to see you soon for the next episode.
Thank you.
Bye,
Always a pleasure.
Indeed.
bye for now.